Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar on successfully navigating current supply chain disruptions. Before we begin, I'd like to review the technical features of today to make today as interactive as possible. Please note, all participant lines are muted to maintain the sound quality. If you would like to ask a question at any time, please enter it in the questions box, which is located on the right side of your screen on the webinar panel. We encourage you to post questions and discussions in the questions box to supplement today's conversation. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to you 24 hours after the conclusion of this call. And now I'd like to introduce Chad Matre, Director, Center of Manufacturing Research for the Manufacturing Institute. Chad?
Thank you, Tyler, and thank you for everyone for participating in today's webinar. This is definitely one of the important topics, and I want to thank PwC and the Manufacturing Leadership Council for helping the Manufacturing Institute schedule this whole event, because this is definitely one of the topics that has got a lot of interest, not just internally, but also amongst a lot of manufacturers, and even on social media. I saw lots of posts there. And when you think about the challenges that manufacturers have had to face over the last year, even looking at the NAM Manufacturers Outlook Survey, the number one issue is rising raw material costs. But in my mind, really the top four issues are really intertwined, right? It's not just rising raw material costs, it's also the supply chain disruptions that we're going to talk about here. It's workforce, the lack of workers, right? That's a large part of the conversation as well. And obviously transportation costs. And all of those issues are really intertwined to be this large headwind that's hitting the overall manufacturing sector. And yet, we also shouldn't bury the lead here. 87% of manufacturers in the most recent Outlook survey from the NAM were positive about their own company's outlook. And what I like to say is demand right now is not the problem. Demand is actually pretty strong, despite all of the challenges that we continue to talk about. And I think you also have to hold up a lot of manufacturers who have really had to do yeoman's work to kind of navigate these supply chain disruptions and keep everything operational. What we hope to get out of today's call is, well, number one, I guess, when will this end, right? I'm sure that will come up. And our members in general think that's probably the second half of the year, but some of these issues are going to be longer lasting than that. But the other thing that we really hope to get out of this is what are some best practices? What are some strategies that manufacturers have had to use to try to navigate these kind of really rough waters? And how does that affect operations for manufacturers, but also how does that change the workforce, and what does life on the shop floor look like? And what might we think longer term and think about how that affects the people we might want to hire, or what training might have to be required. So with that, Tyler, you can go to the next slide, and I'm going to introduce the panel because we have a really great panel here today. I'm going to start here with Devjit Banerjee. He's a partner at PwC. He has a proven track record in industrial products and consumer packaged goods. He brings deep end-to-end operations expertise with over 25 years in consulting and in operational roles. Before joining PwC, he served as a supply chain leader at Bain for roughly 6 years and as a turnaround expert at Alex Partners for 3 years. Prior to consulting, Devjit served in operating roles at Reckitt Benckiser, Castrol, and Tyco. It's easier read than said here. Sorry about that. Devjit holds a degree in chemical engineering at Bangalore University and an MBA from Cornell Johnson Graduate School of Management. The next speaker is Dennis Hoig, and he is Vice President for Global Manufacturing Operations at Nextier Automotive. Obviously, autos is really hot in the market right now. Everyone is talking about what's happening with the chip shortage. I'm sure he will as well. He's responsible for global manufacturing operations, obviously, at Nextier. Responsibility includes defining manufacturing operation priorities and leading the regional operations team to implement improvements to achieve manufacturing cost, delivery, and quality expectations. He's also a member of Nextier's Global Strategy Council and the Global Operations Council. Hoig he's had 43 plus years of automotive experience and served at Nextier in several different assignments. These include serving as Vice President and President of North America, Vice President of Global Operations, Manufacturing Engineering, and Capital Enterprise Systems, Vice President of Engineering, Executive Director of Global Supply Management, Director of Global Manufacturing Engineering, and Plant Manager of Delphi Saginaw Steering Systems. He has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Iowa State and a master's of science from Purdue. So a nice Midwestern guy like myself. And also from the Midwest is my friend Ernest Nicholas. Ernest is, as you can see here, Senior Vice President and Supply Chain Officer, the Chief Supply Chain Officer for Integrated Supply Chain. In this global leadership role, Ernest has overall responsibility of the end-to-end supply chain for Rockwell Automation. Integrated supply chain plans, sources, makes, and delivers Rockwell products and services to customers, and Ernest and his team ensure that the company's supply chain is resilient. I'm sure a word we will hear a lot about today, and agile to support the customers at Rockwell. In 2006, Ernest joined Rockwell Automation as a Lean Six Sigma project manager and has held several roles of increased responsibility within the operations and engineering services functions. Most recently, he was Senior Vice President Operations and Engineering Services, and prior to that, he was Vice President for Global Supply Chain. Prior to Rockwell Automation, he held the supply chain, manufacturing, and engineering functions at General Motors. Ernest holds a bachelor's degree in manufacturing systems engineering from Kettering University in Flint, Michigan, and an MBA in operations management and a master's degree in manufacturing systems engineering from both the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So again, very impressive resumes there and a very important topic today. So I'm going to turn it over first to Devjit to hear what PwC is hearing from your clients in terms of how are they navigating these kind of rocky waters of the supply chain issues right now.
Well, thank you, Chad. So let me start by touching upon a little bit on the current situation that we are seeing around us, right? So the disruption caused by COVID-19 obviously has few parallels from history. The biggest brunt of this disruption was felt as shockwaves throughout supply chains across industries and across geographies, right? Cumulative effect of unmet demand coupled with supply chains under severe stress continue even after vaccination coverage across the world has been somewhat successful in slowing down the critical impact on human health, right? But then geopolitical conflicts have added to the stress as governments around the world are trying to, safeguard local interests, causing a volatile climate in global trade. And then on top of all that, worker shortage, wage inflation continue to add to the stress and constraints speedy recovery, right? So what we are seeing across our client base is that the current supply shortages are the result of historic demand for goods against really what's an inelastic supply chain environment. And that's augmented even further by supportive fiscal policy during the pandemic, where cumulative unmet demand stretched supply chains that were already stressed due to shortages of intermediary inputs, capacity bottlenecks, and obviously labor shortage. All of that still continues to surface and is causing repetitive failure points across almost every node of the value chain, right? Businesses are also facing like record long supply lead times, significant logistic challenges and cost headwinds, right? And then that's further exacerbated by the fact that, companies operated in just-in-time inventory and lean inventory environment, right? And then, there was a lot of adoption of new technologies such as tracking systems, which allowed for businesses to operate with lean environments. So while this has reduced cost, it has made the system somewhat, and in cases very inflexible to unexpected surges in demand and other exogenous shocks, right? New variants of COVID are inducing disruptions as businesses were hoping to stabilize, and as we speak, this has resulted in continued inelasticity of supply chains, making it difficult for businesses to quickly ramp up production in response to critical seasonal and pent-up demand, right? We expect the current supply environment to only improve slowly through this year as strong demand for goods and services fade a bit and supply continues to catch up. However, we don't expect supply issues to fully resolve at least until second quarter 2023. So how are companies taking this on, right? So the two biggest buzzwords across boardrooms, C-suite, across all business corridor is number one, resiliency, number two, agility. So maybe it's important to understand the definitions of these two buzzwords and how they complement each other before I go into the rest of what I'm going to talk about. So resilience is, like the way I define it, resilience is the output of a dynamic risk prediction and mitigation planning process. It is a state of readiness, really, to cope against any form of disruption. Agility, on the other hand, is a capability built into the design of a supply chain to create elasticity as the need arises to switch from one operating plan to another, without cracks developing in the company's ability to continue to serve the market and meet demand profitably. Resilience is achieved when a company has literally a menu of plans to pivot to in order to meet large or small scale disruptions. Agility is the ability to execute those plans without any failure points. So supply chain organizations have traditionally strived for highest levels of service and with year-on-year focus on cost efficiencies. Along with cost efficiencies and service goals, companies have now started to understand the critical importance of building resilience and agility into their future supply chain designs. There are a lot of questions on interest around how to build these capabilities into the future operating model and supply chain. So there's no magic bullet to this, but we have kind of framed a 6-step approach to achieving this resilience, actually a 7-step process to achieve this resilience and agility, right? So step one. So I'm going to cover this as a framework, but I have to caveat this by saying that this is not going to be a vanilla solution to every business problem, right? These are high-level recommendations or design design criteria, but literally these are kind of the stepping stone or the building blocks, as you can say. So what's step one? Step one is the most important. The need to break down cross-functional silos and reorganize supply chain influences and stakeholders as an inherent part of the new supply chain operating model is key. I repeat, is the key to building this resiliency planning process. So what does this mean? So there's a growing recognition that end-to-end operations value chain is the new supply chain definition, replacing the traditional supply chain score model. Some may agree, some may not agree, right? Through all the client work and client interaction that I do and my colleagues at PwC do, and it is safe to conclude that functional teams within supply chain operating in their own individual silos cannot drive step change value performance. It's not enough to optimize within these silos alone. These virtual walls defining the silos need to fall and give way to an operating organization that includes not just traditional silos under the SCORE model, but also must include all the influences of supply chain performance. And all of them should perform towards the same set of goals in an orchestrated manner. Having said that, I'd say that SCORE model has not, I repeat, not lost its relevance. But for a resilient supply chain design, the operating model should recognize all the other key influences and stakeholders of supply chain performance. These are functions like, say, commercial function, marketing organization, folks who are running pricing strategies and tactics, product design functions, engineering, and so on. So once you bring all of these influences and stakeholders and provide them a seat at the table, you can then start standing up modeling and simulation capabilities that can quickly surface multidimensional trade-offs arising at the inflection point where market and commercial priorities clash with traditional supply chain priorities. And we see that happening all the time, right? So this then gets you into a state of readiness to start change management process, to modifying organization behavior, to consistently challenge the business rules and constraints that restrict the true potential of the business. Over designing business rules neither help with profitability nor with winning in the marketplace. I mean, that's the truth. With that, I think if you're able to come to this level, your organization can move towards a well-balanced decision-making capabilities that deliver planning and execution decisions based on total end-to-end, all-encompassing cost to serve, and a differentiated customer service capability instead of trying to win micro battles at the functional silo level, right? So this is a foundation for all the subsequent steps towards building a resilient supply chain, well positioned to win the war in the marketplace under various scenarios of constraints or disruptions. Step 2, this is about disruption planning. Once the functional silos give way to a value chain focused organization, the planning process for building towards resilience can now begin, right? So this is where you begin by defining levels of disruption based on, like, you can think about different sets of criteria, but at a high level, you need to basically categorize the various levels of disruption, like, you see on government at the airport, right? Heightened level of security and so on and so forth. So some of the constituents could be possible sources of disruption, where it's coming from, expected level of impact, how much the impact is going to be, and how long is the duration of this impact disruption. Well, you might not predict, but there are different lengths of time you can simulate, right? Now, how many levels of disruption are defined completely? That completely depends on you guys, individual companies, but it could be something like a level 1 to level 4. And for each level of disruption scenario, level 1, let's say, being normal, level 4 being elevated, there needs to be mitigation plans that need to be created meticulously in advance. And these plans focus mainly with the end goal of how to serve the market demand during disruption to the best extent possible. That's the single point focus. Now, you cannot plan this without a differentiated customer service approach. I mean, in a disrupted situation, you cannot treat all your customers the same, right? So you have to have pre-agreed levels of service for each customer segment, for each disruption level, right? So for each disruption scenario, the service offering by customer segments should be pre-planned and predetermined, pre-documented. For example, which customer segments need to be prioritized with no backlogs versus segments that can be placed on allocation versus, in some instances, customers who might offer a limited portfolio, to whom you might offer a limited portfolio of products or service. So with that having been taken care of, now the output of all these planning steps would be a disruption playbook that clearly redefined business strategy for each level of disruption and clearly articulates the principles based on which every function within the organization will direct resources and serve the market, right? And then finally, creating the plans is not enough, right? To make this as part of the operating DNA, disruption drills will have to be carried out periodically, right? Every organization may plan to do these drills in their own way, but one way to do these drills under normal times without disrupting day-to-day operations could be with the help of simulation softwares that can create disruption scenarios and help evaluate quality of business responses of gaps. So that's about disruption planning. And then moving on to step 3, that's where you would then start to establish connectivity and visibility across end-to-end value chain. That includes, to whatever extent possible, multi-tier supplier network, right? In order to enable connectivity, a technology architecture needs to be designed that allows for data from different streams and technology ecosystem to talk to the host ERP platform, right? And then stitching together the data flow from various parts of the value chain seamlessly, that then allows you to gain visibility across the value chain. We definitely see a lot of interest, energy, and activities around setting up control towers that can literally set up live visualization of end-to-end real-time flow of information and data. That then allows for more efficient, tactical execution planning and your response. And then, last but not the least under connectivity is, to start considering smartening up your factories. So the whole concept of smart factory and smart warehouses are not easy solves, but these can have a step change impact on your performance. These are capital intensive enablers, but return on investment is not very long wherever we've done this kind of work. And it really helps set up the stage for a step change improvement in productivity, better capacity utilization, efficient asset maintenance operations, more consistent quality, and ultimately lower operating costs, right? Step 4, I hope I'm not boring you, but I just want to go through the 7 steps. Step 4 is about taking a renewed look at the network design. This is a huge lever to augment the overall resilience of your operations by incorporating agility and efficiency into the network design. So what are the key design principles of a futuristic network design that's resilient? So first of all, footprint diversification and end-to-end flow simplification should be a part of the inherent design building block, right? Next, taking a look at the targeted onshoring, nearshoring opportunities to cut down the time of supply chain response and to reduce exposure on things that are beyond organization control, like currency volatility, shifts in global trade policies, etc. Right? And other elements, standard elements that go into a network design, right? But then once the basic network design has been drawn up, we need to stress test the design with multiple scenario simulations. This helps us understand the failure points for different scenarios and allows for refining the design with safeguard actions like inventory strategies, capacity augmentation, etc. Moving on, step 5 is about building a resilient sourcing strategy. Goes without saying. I mean, we are living this, and nothing is more important than this particular step. Whether it is capital equipment, heavy engineering production process, or a consumer goods manufacturing environment, one of the ways we found to be very effective is, and I qualify this by saying that there are many other ways to do this, but one of the ways we found this to be very effective is to use the multi-level bill of materials for your products and then travel up and down every level of the bill of material. And for each component, part, or subassembly, stop and ask a set of critical questions. Questions like, are there supplier diversification needs for this component or subassembly? Are there opportunities to conduct a make versus buy rethink? Have you explored nearshoring options versus offshoring? Are there benefits of developing in-house capabilities, or are there vertical integration opportunities, right? And last but not the least, where should we think of long-term partnerships, build deeper relationships with suppliers? Where are the need for long-term commitments and volume buys, et cetera, right? And then step 6 is about something we are living through these days, which is worker shortage, right? So step 6 is a focus on workforce. So, structural shifts in the labor market have left businesses struggling, whether you're a Fortune 100 firm or a small business owner. The competitive labor market, the unprecedented levels of attrition, is still sending out shockwaves across the value chain. However, there are a set of actions that can help address this to a great extent. I'm not sure that can address this problem, fully, but we see a huge amount of focus across the industry to deal with worker shortage by, things like upskilling, empowerment, cross-training, talent recruitment, retention, flexible work arrangements. These are just some of the actions that are the least that can be done to counter the shortage. But beyond that, I think there should be a lot more focus and planning around automating low value add and repetitive tasks, thinking about investing in technology, robots, cobots, smart conveyors, smart warehouses. And really, there should be a nonstop focus on getting rid of any non-value added activities in your operations, right? So there's no really magic to this to counter workforce shortages, but these are ways to reduce the impact, right? And finally, step 7, last but not the least, trying to simplify everything, right? Take out complexity, simplification of product design, simplification of process, simplification in how engineering thinks of functionalities in a product, portfolio design simplification. You think of commonality, platforming, modularization, offering rationalization, and then Designing for disruption is another way, right? Simplification, creating redundancy, whether you're thinking of line capacity, like plant capacity, warehouse capacity, supplier capacity, whatever it is. And these are contingency plans that need to be put in place, which might escalate the cost of your operations. But if you think of the impact of the disruption that we're living through, I was reading a survey where it said, this kind of a disruption can wipe out, around 40 to 50% of your annual, profitability, right? So, those are the 7 steps. I'd be very open to receiving questions later on or to answer questions over email. But with that, I'll hand this back to Chad.
Thank you, Debjit, and thank you for those 7 steps. Very clearly planning and having a disruption playbook, disruption drills, resilient sourcing strategy. Those are notes I put in here. Those are all smart things to do. So now we're going to turn it over to Dennis Hoig, who's going to talk to us about the auto sector. And clearly the auto sector is in the news quite a bit lately. We know that production is down around 6% since last January. Lots of chip shortage issues and other issues. And so how has next year navigated those waters? I'll turn it over to Dennis.
Okay, thanks, Chad. And you're right, it's been a crazy 2 years. And another case that Debjit talked about is the demand is there. Now it's a matter of creating the supply to meet the demand. And it's an honor for me to join all of you this afternoon for this discussion and to share my supply chain views and priorities from a next year perspective. So on the next slide, I just want to reflect what our product line is. We make steering and driveline safety critical products for cars and trucks. And a key part of these products are commodities like electronics, steel, plastics, copper, aluminum, rare earth, all of which require special effort right now, just because of the demand and the strains that are on the supply chain. So next slide, please. This reflects our global manufacturing footprint. We're in every region of the world, and this really does create some significant supply challenges and opportunities in this current environment. So next slide, we've all been battling macroeconomic and environmental issues, and these are probably very common to you all, some, but COVID's been the headlines, been a very big impact on us on a manpower basis, both with us and with our supply base. Chad mentioned electronic shortages, very much in the news. Lead times increasing, the issues with ports, containers, trucks, shipping, we've all battled. Natural disasters continue, and then the manpower impacts both internally and externally. And we've always talked, and it's more true now than ever, that there will always be a disruption. It's how we prepare and manage for each one really is critical for the business. And it's been very common in the auto industry to talk about just in time, and even in other industries. Really, we're talking now about changing that to be minimum amount required. So no longer just in time, but what is the minimum amount required? So next slide, I just want to reflect the 6 priorities we have as a company. The first one is standards. What principles do we follow? What best practices do we have? Because we are a global operation, we do have 27 plants. How do we share that? And then the key part of this is to have a common data platform, demand and BOM information being in a common platform. And we worked very hard to get to that point. The supply and demand visibility has already been mentioned, but it's not so much just the short term, but it's now medium term and long term. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Inventory is always a challenge. It's been more of a challenge now than ever because of the mismatch of schedules, shortages, and then putting safety stock in place for these suppliers that are at risk really has put a lot of strain on inventory and has driven inventory up. Advanced supply chain planning really is becoming a highlight now, that we're understanding what decisions are made much earlier in the business cycle and how do we insert ourselves into that point to take that risk away and manage that better. How do we deal with suppliers on current risk? Is that risk mitigation? A lot of it has to do with manpower or material supplies, and then again, safety stock. And then, as mentioned, the logistics efficiency and cost. How do we manage the longer lead times? How do we manage these freight streams and what's happening? And then the weather disruptions. You know, there's always something that is in the way. So next slide. We stepped back and examined our supply chain influencers. So we looked at GSM, which is our purchasing department. And obviously they have an impact on supply chain. They are a key part of that. You know, through their sourcing, with their contracts, when do we take ownership of material? What strategy do we have? Dual sourcing, what quality issues have we had in the past? And then tariffs and even consignment. Do we consign material or not? And then on the engineering side, they really do have an impact, but they don't necessarily understand that. It's around, is their design flexible? How do they handle part proliferation? How do we look at what design rules we have in place that causes us to have more part numbers, for example, or more inventory? And then the business lines, what decisions do they make early on in business that they're pursuing? Do they have a good supply chain strategy? And we have found that we've focused very much on our bill of material cost, but less on the supply chain. And so we're going back and adding more rules on the business line side so that those decisions can be made smarter earlier. And we found in the plants, you don't have as much control over those, and we want to get more control into those decisions. On the sales side, it goes back to customer contracts, service plans, demand plans, how clear is demand coming from the customer. Our production control and logistics group is around freight, duty, tariffs, you know, understanding the demand, and also the data platforms. How visible is the data and how visible are the inputs and outputs to the system? And then it comes down to the manufacturing plants. How are you dealing with safety stock, issues you're having with first-time quality, how you're scheduling, what you have for raw versus work in process, how are you managing your finished goods, and just your overall visibility and control inside the plant. So next slide, we talk about our supply chain planning, and we really stepped back and looked at it as an extended planning model. And it was so easy to work within a 0 to 3 month time frame, but really the electronics has really taught us to step back and think not only this 18-month lead time, but even further back than that. So we bucketed it to an operational planning within the short time frame of 0 to 3 months. This is what the manufacturing plants own, how they manage what's coming in, what they manage as freight, how they're scheduling inside their plants, current demand schedules from our customers. Then there's this tactical bucket from 3 to 18 months. That's driven by long-term decisions. So how do we manage demand planning, our lead time planning, transportation planning? And this is where the supply chain owns. And we've created a smaller group now that is this middle tactical group of a supply chain. And then strategic, this is where the enterprise owns. That goes back to those 6 buckets I mentioned in the previous slide. It's around demand planning, project planning, decisions that we make up front, and really question ourselves on a strategic basis. What do we have to do to make the supply chain better, reduce our inventory, reduce our costs, and make material flow better? So that's all around business support and business structure. So last slide, we're very focused on our digital journey. And these are 7 roles of our digital trace system. We have spent a lot of time and effort over the last several years down the path of putting a lot of digital processes, digital controls, and what we call digital trace in our manufacturing plants. We have very common systems. We implement them globally, and we're proud of the progress we've made, but really now have learned that we can do more on the supply chain side by extending that knowledge into the supply chain rules and visibility. So we're focused on our bill of material, how we release that into our system and releasing it sooner. Now that we're looking at an 18-month lead time, our intent is to release that sooner in the design process, in this business process, so it'll give us more lead time to be able to procure material and to get it on order, especially the key materials that are in concern today. Our demand planning focused on the day, the week, the month, and relationships across the supply chain and down the tiers. Everybody talks about that, but we're working very hard to be able to see down the tiers to understand where our risks are, and even to look at disaster planning and issues that are happening, because as everybody knows, every day something new is happening. There is always something out there that's going to disrupt us. We're applying different allocation rules to our production schedule, especially materials that are short. Paying more attention to our quality control, lot control in our plants. We've really digitized the material coming into the plants and flowing through our plants. Warehouse distribution internally, how we manage that material, how we control that material, and how we get it out into the manufacturing floor. And then moving away from transactions, making them automated, and allow our folks to get off from doing the transactional work and getting to analysis. We really want people to bring their hearts and minds to work and get away from just doing transactional work. So with that, I appreciate the time. I thank you for your attention. I'll be interested in any questions at the end. So back to you, Chad.
Well, thank you. And I think a lot of folks are probably thinking about that digital journey now and how you can use data to kind of navigate the supply chain challenges that you have. So just a reminder that if you have any questions for any of the panelists, you can enter them in the window next to you, the chat box, and we will be able to get those after our next panelist. So next up is Ernest Nicholas from Rockwell Automation, and he's our cleanup hitter. You're gonna give us a home run getting out of here, right? So talking about supply chain issues and how Rockwell has navigated those. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I appreciate you having me join the panel here, quite honestly. This is obviously a topic that's near to dear to anybody that's working in supply chain operations. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to jump in pretty quickly, and I'm going to talk a bit about Rockwell very shortly, and then I'll walk through kind of my interpretation of what you've heard from the first two panelists. You know, first thing about Rockwell, for those of you that don't know, we are the world's largest company that's dedicated to industrial automation and information. As an organization, we're just under a $7 billion company. I'll talk a bit later about our demand because everyone's talking about the demand that's out there. We're anticipating quite a bit of growth as a result of several of the items that have been talked about by both panelists. We support a wide range of industries, food and beverage, oil and gas, automotive, CPG, and the company has been around for quite some time. So excited to join you. Lots to talk about relative to Rockwell Automation. We can go to the next slide. As an organization, you know, we often talk about the connected enterprise, and the connected enterprise is really this notion of how do we drive connectivity to make our customers more efficient, whether that's leveraging our software solutions, our services, or ultimately our products, which drive automation. That's how we like to think about what we use to support our customers. That's why you see this moniker of expanding human possibility. We often talk about this notion of understanding the customers, combining our domain expertise with their knowledge, all in an effort to simplify the customer's experience to drive efficiency amongst their supply chain as we work through just kind of end-to-end solutions for other organizations. So just to give you a brief synopsis of what Rockwell is, we can go to the next slide. I often try to level set when I talk about these challenges, and specifically, you've heard everyone mention their view of what these challenges are. I'll often start with kind of these two buckets. You know, many have forgotten, just because of the challenge of the pandemic, how much we were going through just prior to the pandemic. We had several macroeconomic challenges, right? There were constrained markets that existed in several pockets before we kicked off with the pandemic, right? There were labor challenges. There were also electronic component challenges. They were of a different nature and a different order of magnitude, but they existed. We were seeing significant fluctuations in spot pricing of raw materials. And what we do not want to forget is protectionism, the global trade wars. All of that was creating an environment that we had to think differently about how we manage supply chain. It was getting us away from this notion of lean supply chain. I won't say lean manufacturing, but lean supply chain, being as lean as possible or turning that towel dry to get as much efficiency and as much cost out of the supply chain. We were starting to think about pivoting away from that. Then here comes the pandemic. And I bucketize this into 3 areas because this is what we are experiencing as Rockwell Automation, right? There was the initial phase of we came home. And whether you talk about that from any location globally, we came home and it was a matter of just supporting organizations to function. How do we keep employees safe? How do we still support our supply chain? Well, that also quickly pivoted to, should we be right-sizing our supply chain? And the right-sizing was really the result of the downturn that we saw immediately, but that was very quickly followed up by an acceleration in this return to business growth that the vast majority of us have seen. And that return to business growth for Rockwell has been substantial. And I say that from the perspective, Rockwell has not only returned to growth, but with the resurgence of onshoring, of regionalization, of the labor shortages that quite honestly have rendered business cases for automation much more profitable, much more beneficial with shorter returns. Our growth has honestly been substantial. We're seeing record numbers of orders. We're also seeing record shipments, but I can say in between, I also have record backlogs as a direct result of what we're seeing with the electronics component market. We can go to the next slide. As I pivot to this slide, and you heard Debjit talk a bit about agility and resiliency, I'm defining it here based on what I felt were the appropriate elements for our organization for us to think about how we solve these challenges. When we talked about the macroeconomics, as I mentioned before, we were already pivoting away from the lean supply chain toward a more agile supply chain. And we were thinking about that as being much more offensive and much more strategic. And that's why you see this notion of ensuring this right cost, service, and quality, looking at the external marketplace factors as well as internal decisions. But internal decisions for us, essentially, that's a strategy for the company. How are we thinking about managing our organization, product lifecycle management? How are we thinking about being acquisitive as an organization? But the items in blue, from our perspective, were all areas in which we were thinking about elements that we had to improve in order to create agility for our organization. But then, as I mentioned before, here comes the pandemic. So now as you have the pandemic, well, we need to mitigate against all this disruption. Well, that's very defensively oriented. So while on the left, I talked about strategic inventory as we got away from being so lean, well, on the right, we have to think about protection of supply and just how do we get enough components to manage through this. So that just becomes a different challenge. As we look at network visibility, we're thinking very aggressively about network visibility. How do we understand where our inventory is? How do we understand how our products are moving through the network? That shifted to market intelligence. How do we now understand what our demand is going to look like, especially as it's shifting? Both coming into the pandemic and working our way through the pandemic initially, the demand fluctuations were so significant that you couldn't really rely on your typical S&OP process. Similarly with end-to-end orchestration, now you have to think about scenario planning. And the last that I think is most important is just that redundancy. Thinking about redundant manufacturing, redundant warehousing, honestly, everywhere through your supply chain where you honestly think there are some challenges. But all in all, I say all these things just to put into perspective, we had a strategy and we were working on a strategy that was based on agility. Through the introduction of the pandemic, through the ideas of resiliency, we only had to reprioritize. And that I'm very thankful for. I think if there's one element that the pandemic has called out, if there was not a strategy to begin with, you either needed to develop one very quickly or you had to be able to pivot. Otherwise, this could have been and still is a bit more painful for those that weren't working on some of these items to begin with. Let's go to the next slide. As I shift to this slide, what I want to share is, about a year ago, as an organization, we made a decision that while we were chasing our way through what I'd say is a lot of the pandemic, we also had to think about we were growing so aggressively and we wanted to be strategic about it. And so we at that point, we bifurcated the supply chain org. You heard Debjit talk earlier about just the traditional functions, which we have, right? The plan, source, make, deliver. But we were so focused on execution as we worked through the high backlog in chasing, whether it was transportation, chasing the labor market, chasing components. But we took a step back and said, look, we've got a plan, and we know we have line of sight to be a much bigger company. So how do we strategically think about that and put the right expansion of capacity into play to balance this agility and resiliency that I just talked about? We landed on this as a short form version of that, right? And these three buckets really are around technology, design, and then physical capacity. And I've got a few examples on the upcoming slides, but just to give you an idea of what I mean by technology, how are we faster to the right decision? And how do we leverage technology accordingly to make us faster to the right decision? From a design perspective, we were already going after what I'd say is DFX, design for excellence. We had several different elements of design for excellence that we were targeting. Those elements included the basics of design for manufacturing and assembly, but we had introduced design for resiliency. And design for resiliency in this case was really around how do we think about continuation, where we have to redesign sooner, and then how do we think about introducing resiliency into our new product design? And the whole point of putting it into new product design is to ensure that the decisions are made up front, and if they are not made that ensure resiliency, that they're escalated accordingly to some form of executive leadership where we can be certain that we're installing it on our most critical areas, our most critical components. And then the last item, but by all means, is just, again, that physical capacity. Are we going to put the capital in place, whether it's for automation or for physical manual assembly lines, to be certain that we can support our growth, whether it's at suppliers, our own manufacturing, or ultimately being certain we can support the pipeline through our distribution and our warehousing, our warehousing, our internal warehousing. So with that, I want to give you a few examples, and I'll touch upon them very quickly. I know we're tight on time, but I want to just give a few examples of how we're thinking about this from a technology perspective. So next slide, please. So the first we talk about from a technology standpoint is closed loop operating system. And you can see off at the top left, we talk about digitally enabling our lean manufacturing core. But what we're really doing here is we're starting with a finite scheduler. We're automating, honestly, the workflows of finite scheduling by taking clean production orders. We're mating that with what I tell you are our constraints, our bottlenecks on those given lines. And we're ultimately now visualizing both the operator assignments as well as how an operator or assembly line is functioning throughout the day. Again, as I walk you through that, please continue to think about when we say closed loop, we've got this constraint. We now are scheduling accordingly, and we're leveraging that to be certain that our production supervisors, our production managers are now monitoring our execution on an ongoing basis. This has been, quite honestly, a peek into visibility for what we can actually accomplish from an execution standpoint throughout all of our factories. We leverage that information, especially that constraint database, as we move on and we expand upon that to think about how we do advanced planning. Please go to the next slide. While we built closed loop operating system on our own technology, it's coded leveraging Rockwell tools. We then expand to think a little bit broader across our network. So we've gone from inside the factory to now thinking about from our factories to our DCs, to our regional DCs, and in some cases to our warehouses. So we're doing now DRP, but we're looking again, leveraging that same level of capacity granularity that we now understand to think about how we replenish the network. So this has become more important for us, especially as I consider the fact that we've very heavily been a make to stock environment for years. But given the limitations of some of the component availability, we've had to pivot in many instances to more of a build to order. So knowing where our product is at any given point in time is very important as we communicate to our customers availability. We can go to the next slide. That plays right into how we thought about we need increased visibility. For years and years, again, we've had so much stock in our channel, we didn't need visibility from a transportation perspective. Yes, it was a nice to have, we were always cognizant of it, but not nearly as required as it is today. So we're in the process of installing greater visibility here. Again, you can see the logos on the bottom right of who we're leveraging to support that. But we've got some very specific business outcomes. You know, we've got a couple of different phases that we're going after. What's in orange is kind of the first step, and then we'll go after what's in black after that. But as you can see, we're starting to build upon ourselves. We start with thinking about capacity to be certain we understand our capacity, especially during these times. We plan accordingly across our network, and now we're adding visibility to our network. And that leads to my last slide, which is really around network design and network optimization, and thinking about how we answer these questions that are listed. How do we position, whether it's a product line or inventory, to be certain we have this digital twin to help us make decisions and answer questions about what's next. And so I think all of that's important as we walk through kind of this cadence of how do we drive improvement to not only manage what's happening today, but to think about how we're going to be a better supply chain tomorrow. And that for me is what's most important as I think of my responsibility as Chief Supply Chain Officer, is to lay this foundation, to lay this infrastructure for who we're going to be as an organization. So while I've shared with you what I think is important from a technology perspective, as I mentioned before, there are several other elements that were mentioned both by Debjit and Dennis that we were considering. But I thought these were important for us to hone in on because there are also some key initiatives that are very necessary for people to consider. What do you need moving forward in order to be certain you can manage and function in the future or this new supply chain? So with that, can we go to my closing slide, if you don't mind? And I always try to close with this, especially with my internal team, about this idea of relentlessly prioritizing. There's so much going on right now, right? There's so much disruption that Chad talked about. He talked about disruption from a labor perspective, disruption in transportation, disruption by not having components. But I've been very explicit to share with my team, there's kind of two camps here, right? There's a camp that's focusing on execution, and there's a camp that's focused on its capacity expansion, which is truly a mini transformation. But I need them to focus, and given that we've got so much noise from the entire organization, we want to be certain we manage our priorities. So there's a lot that we're saying not now to, internal to Rockwell, internal to the company that people are asking for, but it's not a matter of no. It's more a matter of we've got to get these things finished in order to be certain that we can support the organization as we grow and as we, again, lay this foundation for the infrastructure needed to be a bigger company. So with that, I'll turn back to Chad, but I appreciate your time and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. And you definitely hit on one of the themes that I wanted to talk about, which was how do we make ourselves better from this experience. But in the meantime, I guess I'll ask the other panelists to come up here, and we have a question, which actually was one of the other ones I have on my screen, so I'll start there. How do you determine the strategy around nearshoring versus offshoring for procurement? The cost of nearshoring versus the cost of supply agility. And I think, this is one of the things that I'm often asked in the press, and I've often said this is a unique opportunity, right? This is the time where we should, we're seeing such huge freight costs everywhere else and such disruption. Maybe we can make it here, right? And so how do you answer that question? How do you determine the strategy around whether you should nearshore or not?
Well, I can jump in first if you want. We've spent a lot of time and effort looking at that because you look at the waves of tariffs, duties, and even now the USMCA. All of that a year ago changed, right? Or a year and a half ago. So we are rethinking what it takes to do things locally. We've tried now to go back and source locally in the regions and move away from offshoring to more onshoring. It's not a perfect answer yet because there's still cost issues. There's material cost issues too. But I think the landscape changed a lot because of some of the tariffs and duties and some of those things that have been put in place.
I would agree. We've had a similar approach. We've thought a bit about this, both for our manufacturing as well as for our own procurement. A lot of it, quite honestly, still goes back to our basic total cost model, right? Looking at your piece price and all the other elements. But I think to Dennis's point, the additional elements that make up your supply chain cost, we're just adding to them. So while the list may have been X deep before, it's X plus 5 other factors now. And I think that's just been the ongoing challenge, is how can you be certain that you're considering them as you build your financial models and you make your decisions?
You're on mute, Debjit.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just add one quick point. I think there's the mathematics, right? There's the math around like the total landed cost model, like Ernest mentioned. The other intangibles are becoming more important, right? The exposure to currency volatility, the exposure to cross-border tariffs and trade impact. I think there should be a way to factor those in, right? Maybe not in the form of a true cost model, but somehow it could be a quantitative or semi-quantitative way of like layering in on top of the mathematical model.
So we have time for one other question, and it's going to hit on how does this make us better? I'm going to kind of tee off of Ernest's how you ended your conversation there. So we come out of this experience having gone through a lot of smart decision making and challenge and pulling out your hair, right? But how does this make us better, right? And how do you think this changes manufacturing long term? And I guess I'll weave in workforce into this conversation, right? How does it change the type of worker we need? I mean, you mentioned technology and the need for digitization and data skills, right? Maybe you need more people getting supply chain management degrees, right? What do you think changes long term that makes manufacturing better from this experience?
Well, I'll try to answer that maybe, and then Ernest and Dennis can jump in. I think it's like I mentioned, it's helping us break down the silos, right? In the past, like even a year back, like there was this whole siloed mentality of like supply chain and manufacturing almost operating as order taking organizations, fulfillment organizations, right? I think the importance of supply chain as an operating unit has been magnified, right? And the need to collaborate cross-functionally is heightened much more than ever before, right? And this can only help in terms of how the business can think, holistically and go after, winning the battles and the wars in the marketplace, right? As far as workforce, the change that we are seeing as a result of all the workforce shortage and the skills needed to survive, I think this is an inflection point, really, right? Because in the past, people were skilled to do a particular job day in and day out, right? And we are almost saying that the technology is changing around you. The environment in which you operate is changing, right? So how can you upskill yourself? I think that is being absorbed by not just companies but also people who are participating in the labor market, right? So there's a lot of vigor around upskilling individual skills and talent, like a lot of urgency to get trained on all aspects that are going to help them survive in the future. I think that's a big positive change that we're seeing.
So Ernest or Dennis, anything quick? I know we're running out of time here. Any quick comments there?
I'm going to say something quick, Chad. We went from a short-term view to a long-term view, long-term even longer now. Ernest was right. It's X plus 5 or 10 more things when you go and look at cost. And so I think we've gotten smarter and we've taught our people that the enterprise is a key part of the supply chain. It's not just one function or two. And then the jobs of the future, I think, haven't been defined yet. These digital roles, these digital jobs, they're yet to be defined. And then we need to train people to be able to take on those new roles.
Great. Ernest?
I'll add one last thing, and I kind of hinted at it before. All of us are laying kind of infrastructure for our supply chains and infrastructures for our company, and everybody's growing. So we have so many kind of real-time decisions that we can make now that are going to honestly support our organizations into the future. Those decisions, in my mind, they've got to be focused on just advancement. Again, I made the comment of fast is the right decision. That's what I feel I need. There are other areas in which each organization needs. I think we just have to continue to think about that evolution. There's so much technology that's available now. There's so many pieces of equipment that we're refreshing, that we're upgrading right now. and each offer us another opportunity to drive another level or another layer of improvement. So I think that's important to keep in mind, because that in of itself will help us just be better as we move forward.
Well, this has all been fascinating, and like I said, everyone is talking about supply chains now and navigating these waters, and so hopefully everyone got a little grain of a nugget here out of it that you can find helpful. We could have kept talking longer, but our time is up, and so I want to thank the great panel, Debjit, Dennis, and Ernest. If you have any other questions that we didn't get to, I know one of them came in right there at the tail end. Just email me. We'll make sure we get a response back. And thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.